So David, now down to the fourth video, right? So we did a few videos before about we talked about like CSS in general, animations, and why you use them, and then the flip technique to make animations run on GPU. You can check the videos for that, and also the finite state machine for modeling transitions, and making sure that you don't have some kind of weird transitions between states that don't even exist. Now I want to dig deeper into something like a bit more basic, but it's still very important. CSS variables.
Yeah.
So first, what are CSS variables? And here we're talking about CSS variables, and then maybe we can do a contrast with other things like SAS variables and stuff like that.
Sure. So CSS variables are also known as CSS custom properties, and that's exactly what they are. Instead of just having a normal property defined, you would define 2 dashes and then whatever property you want. And basically CSS variables, which I like to call them, it's just easier that way. Yeah, you could use them where you would use normal CSS values in a rule set where you could just define custom styles. For example, you could define a color or a size or any other valid value in CSS and just use them anywhere.
Just any value. Right. And how can we use them? Where are they? Why are they interesting?
Well, take theme for instance. Let's say that you want to provide both a light mode and a dark mode on your website, right? So you might have a CSS variable for foreground color and a CSS variable for background color that you define on the root. So that would be :root, or you could define on HTML or body, but typically the convention is to use root. And so we could say foreground is black, background is white, and then anywhere we could just put color, var, and then double dash foreground color and use that, same for background. And then if we need to provide a toggle for switching to dark mode, now we could change just that one variable. We could change foreground color to white, background color to black, and that's going to change everywhere where that CSS variable is used. Well, it's inherited, so it's top down.
Right. Do you find other examples, like more complex examples of using CSS variables where they really shine?
Oh, sure. So before we had CSS variables, if you wanted to do something like a dynamic animation on a property, similar to what GSAP or other animation libraries would do, you would have to change the style directly of any elements that you wanted to animate. And what that meant is you had to have a reference to every single element that needed to move and change position. And that became problematic because if the element disappeared or if you had new elements come in, now you had to grab a reference to that and make sure that that was being animated as well. With CSS variables, instead of that, all you have to do is set the CSS variable on some element or some container or something, and all of the elements that use that CSS variable are going to get that dynamic value.
So you animate the variable itself.
You animate
the value
just
of the
variable.
Oh,
yeah.
Nice. So that's so it's very interesting for animations then.
It's very interesting and very flexible.
Right. So even in like, maybe I'm saying nonsense here, but if you take it like you're moving from the light mode to the dark mode, you can animate that change as well.
Sure, you could animate that. There's also similar libraries where I forget what it's called. It's some scrolling library where basically you could put in a CSS variable the scroll position, like how far up or down you are on a page, and then you could use that CSS variable anywhere. So you could even do scroll-based animations just based on that little CSS variable.
Nice, nice. And how is that different from what we had in the past with SAS variables and stuff like that?
So with SAS variables, those are calculated and compiled before the style sheet goes on the page. So they're very useful for when you have repeating styles, but at the end of the day, if you have like a variable that's 13 pixels, that's just going to be hard-coded as 13 pixels all throughout your style sheet. Whereas if you have a CSS variable, now it's dynamic. You could change it at any time using JavaScript.
Nice. So basically, the other variables, like they just like find and replace, basically.
Yeah.
So they remove duplication, which is nice, but they are not dynamic. So basically, you can't animate them.
Exactly.
And that's a huge change, difference, right?
Yeah, and that's why a lot of people get them confused with SAS variables, and they say, why do we need CSS variables when we have SAS or less or stylus variables, but they are different.
Very different, because they exist in runtime. They exist after you compile, and they still there.
Right.
Very nice. There's another question that I wanted to also to ask you about. Like, since we are like clarifying these kind of concepts, there is a new concept I mean, new. It's not new, but people are more talking about it. It's CSS grids.
Yeah.
And people were so enthusiastic about Flexbox, and then CSS grids and came, and people maybe are sometimes confusing the use of one or the other, whereas they are very different creatures, very different properties, and they can be used in very different contexts.
You could think of it as a Venn diagram. Like you have a set of things that you would definitely use Flexbox for, you would definitely use Grid for, and then some things in the middle where you might use one or both. But with Grid, I like to think of it as a rigid structure. So of course it could be a little bit flexible, but it's when you know exactly how many rows you have or exactly how many columns you're going to have, or the content is predictable and you want it in a very predictable way. Flexbox is more for when you have a dynamic number of items where you don't know how many are going to be in there. So for example, if you want them all nicely centered or aligned in a certain way, depending on how many there are, you would use Flexbox. But Grid, if you have a very specific, this needs to be the sidebar, this needs to be a header, this needs to be the body, then that's what you would use Grid for.
So for instance, if I have like a display in a section of a website, some kind of cards, they will be more Flexbox.
Yes, cards would be Flexbox for sure. But the container for where those cards lie within the overall layout, that might be CSS Grid.
Now maybe this is now a middle case where we're like in the middle between both. Now, if there are these on the website, these kind of sections where you have text and image, right, left, right, left, right, left, and they sometimes they swap left, right. What would you use for that?
So you're talking about like the typical media box design where you have like a picture and then you have
some text, yeah.
Yeah. So before, I remember when you would use float left to do that and all of that, and then
all of that,
and then you might use Flexbox as well to handle that, where you could just say, and that works for many use cases. But in my opinion, CSS Grid would be a better choice, because then you could define this image should take up exactly this space, and the text should take up this space over here. And another big difference is that with CSS Grid, you have what's called grid gap. So you could define a gap between the image and the text. Before, with Flexbox or float or anything like that, you would have to put a margin somewhere. And the question becomes, where does that margin go? Does it go on the image? Does it go on the text?
Yeah.
And CSS Grid removes that doubt. It's like, it doesn't go on any of them. It's part of the grid.
It's part of the grid. It's a gap between them, and it is guaranteed. And you can change it easily if you choose to, because
exactly.
It's its own element, right? Do you have other examples where like it's unclear if it's the CSS Grid that should be used or the Flexbox? Can you think of other things where like, maybe people are confusing the two?
Pretty much any instance where you would think to use Flexbox or Grid is going to be a little bit confusing. Maybe navigation items, but you could have so many different navigation items, and so that's why you would probably use Flexbox for that. So I would just say use Grid for the bigger layout items, use Flexbox for the dynamic items.
Dynamic items.
Yeah.
So if I again, you said card or things where you need to scroll, that's obviously a Flexbox.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
But maybe there are some interesting properties about Flexbox that you can easily invert things. Like if you want to invert the order and manipulate dynamically the content, then Flexbox is really nice for that.
Right.
Whereas the Grid is a bit too rigid.
Grid is rigid, but you could also change the order of things, and it's sort of like a two-dimensional way of sort of doing it. Well, when you have let's say that you define a display grid on an element. When you define an element should be here or here, it doesn't necessarily need to be in the order that it lies in the DOM. Instead, you could say, whereas with Flexbox, you would have order 1, order 2. You could change the order of things. With Grid, you could say, put this on this row and this column and make it stretch to here. So you have more precise control.
So it's about precise control, basically.
And so that's
what you said in the beginning. Anyway.
Yeah. And so that's a major difference between Flexbox and Grid 2. Think of Flexbox as one-dimensional, either column or row. Grid, it's two-dimensional.
I like it. I
Yeah.
like that. I like that. Okay, very interesting. Thank you very much for explaining that. I hope it clarifies things for
Yeah.
people.
Thank you.